Hi, we're the Unitarian Universalist Church of Nashua, New Hampshire. Do you know what's in your church's archives? We didn't either.
Hello, I'm Jody Calico Holloway from the Unitarian Universalist Church of Nashua, New Hampshire. I'm a brown-haired white woman with glasses, with the background of a very green New Hampshire cemetery behind me. Recently, a small research project that we did somehow turned into an unexpected and beautiful way to shed light on a forgotten and unflattering part of our own history. Today, we'll tell you about how we did our research, what we uncovered, and what we did with that new knowledge. In short, we learned about a brilliant man who grew up in our own church in Nashua in the mid-1900s, a Black man, Jeffrey Campbell, who became a Universalist minister. But because of racism in our church and in our world, Reverend Campbell was consistently sidelined and ignored by the UU denomination throughout his life, and almost entirely forgotten after his death in 1984. But 5 or so years ago, when we were reintroduced to him and his family, we were able to research him, remember him, and start to atone somewhat. We were able to reconcile ourselves somewhat with our imperfect spiritual ancestors in Unitarian Universalism, thanks to our research and sharing that research with the people, the churches, and the organizations around us. And it's helping us to make a small difference in our New Hampshire community ongoing. So our hope is that we encourage you and that we share with you about how your group too might find satisfaction and success if you try researching in the archives. In this presentation, we'll use the metaphor of planting a seed and helping it to grow and flower and spread. So, first, let's meet the minister of our church and the panel of researchers who act as the gardeners for the seed in our story.
I'm Reverend Allison Palm. My pronouns are she, her. I serve as the minister at the UU Church in Nashua. I am a white woman with short brown hair wearing a blue shirt and a black blazer.
I'm Roy Goodman. I am a mid-70s white guy. I've been a member of this church for about 26, 27 years. I am wearing a gray shirt and blue jeans.
My name's Tristan Husby. I've belonged to this church for almost 10 years. I am a white guy with a beard and brown hair and glasses, and I'm wearing a blue button-up shirt and a black blazer.
I'm Harry Perkiser. I've been a member of this church since the 1980s, which makes me sort of the greatest generation era white guy with silver hair and beard.
I'm Kathy Fletcher. I also am a member of this church. I'm a white cisgender woman living in a larger body. I'm in my late 50s. I have dark hair that's going gray, and I wear big, dark-rimmed, thick glasses.
It was in 2016 that the social justice working group of our church really got energized, unfortunately, by the news of the day, especially the increasing number of news stories about police brutality and racial violence and murder. Folks in our church, like me, were opening our eyes, asking ourselves, how can we help? What can we do? We were becoming aware and ready to take action. Or you could say that the ground was prepared for a seed to come along.
It was a time where it felt like every week Black people were being killed by police. And it was just after the death of Sandra Bland, who in Texas, the four of us sort of sat together morosely saying, you know, it's terrible what's happening. And I remember saying, we are four middle-aged white ladies. What are we going to be able to do about this? And one of the other clever church ladies said, we are members of a church. So our first, like all, in my mind, social movements, we had to start with consciousness raising and education.
Where did the seed come from for our research project? Well, there's a very respected series of annual presentations exploring UU theologies and practices called the Men's Lectures. When these lectures were held in Boston in 2017, several of our panelists were lucky enough to attend.
The lecturer, Mark Morrison Reed, was telling us about black ministers in the Unitarian and Unitarian Universalist faiths. And he mentions a black minister by the name of Jeffrey Campbell, who had, as a youth, gone to church at the Universalist Church in Nashua, New Hampshire. Well, we're from Nashua, New Hampshire, and we looked at each other and said, we don't know who this is. We've never heard of him. We began to think of this young black preacher as being a spiritual ancestor of ours, specifically ours. Here was a man that we'd never heard of that apparently had some influence on Unitarian Universalism, and we wanted to know more about him. So we started the research project.
And here's where we get to the work of researching, just being curious, exploring what we might find out about this Reverend Campbell. We learned he was born in 1911 to a white mother, Lillian Campbell, and a black father who was killed in a racially motivated incident when Jeffrey was 12 years old. Once we started looking, we actually found his name in a lot of places, along with that of his sister, Marguerite. It's like our gardeners were starting to figure out what kind of little seed we'd received for our garden.
And that was really sort of the impetus for beginning to do some kind of serious research, digging into our own archives. Well, calling them archives is probably not correct, but it was a closet full of stuff. And so we found some items there. For instance, the membership book where he and his mother Lillian had signed as members of the Universalist Church in Nashua.
And I will say that we also did reading outside of the archival work as well. So we looked at Reverend Mark Morrison Reed's book, Black Pioneers in a White Denomination, as well as John Hurley's chapter about Jeffrey and Marguerite Campbell in Darkening the Doorways.
Well, who was this guy? What did he experience in our church? And one of the things we did was to look in the local newspaper, because one of the wonderful things about being in a relatively small city is that local newspapers covered everything. And so we found many references to Jeffrey and Lillian and Marguerite as they participated in events at the schools, and certainly as they participated in events at the church. And it was obvious that this family was very involved in the church and also in the community. The school yearbooks would also, again, showed Jeffrey in particular. Marguerite was a little more reticent, but Jeffrey was active in all kinds of societies, and he was, both of them were editors of the yearbook. And and he was a poet, and he was in debating club and all kinds of stuff. So that was, that began to sort of fill out their early lives in our city.
And I remember feeling very excited seeing that list of all of the activities that Jeffrey was involved with at the Nashua High School, because it suddenly made it click for me why he was also a dedicated educator throughout much of his life, because while in the 1930s and 40s, when he was stuck in the United Kingdom during World War II, he did adult education to support himself there, and then afterwards, when he came back to the United States and he couldn't find a full-time paying ministry position, he supported himself as a high school teacher at the Putney School. And so it was clear that school for him was a place where he felt those kinds of connections and sought them out later in life as well.
We even found out that Lillian was the church secretary for a while. So they were clearly very involved in the church and in the community. And so I think it continued to mystify us that we had never heard of these folks, particularly since Jeffrey became a minister and Marguerite worked for the denomination.
I think the next step was General Assembly in 2017. I was there, and also there was the Harvard Theological School library. And I asked them, do you have anything on Jeffrey Campbell? And sure enough, 2-3 weeks later, I get these files of dozens of documents about Jeffrey Campbell. Letters he wrote, letters written to him, letters written about him. Just a whole trove of information that we never knew. But one of the things that we learned was that he was the first African-American student at Lawrence Theological School up in northern New York State. And there's a whole bunch of correspondence about whether he should or shouldn't be admitted because of his race. I mean, the letters are pretty blunt. And there's a whole lot of correspondence once he graduates. What are we going to do with him now? Is he going to be able to find a ministry? Is he going to be able to find a church? Ordain him, and if we do, will he find a church? So that was all in those letters.
Yeah, I would love to hear if there was a place in this research where Jeffrey really came alive for each of you.
Well, for me, it was a letter written to a friend of his who was also a UU minister. And he was talking about his life. And one of the things he said was that one of his big disappointments in life was that he had never been invited to preach at his home church. And that really got to me. That really got to me. I mean, this was in the early 1980s. It wasn't 100 years ago. It was in my lifetime.
And it was certainly in the living memory of a
many
lot of
people.
folks in our congregation. We have a lot of long-term folks, including one person who grew up in the Universalist Church as well and remembers the Campbell family. So it really wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
Our research project was about to hit a turning point. We already knew by now that Reverend Campbell served for many years as an unpaid on-call minister, and he even preached at the UU General Assembly, our highest national conference, in 1969. We were already really saddened that even after all those years of service, after his excellent references and a quick mind, he was never called to a full-time ministry by any UU congregation. Instead, we saw him publishing eloquent articles, occasionally but throughout his life, that defended himself and his sister from overtly racist exclusions and subtly racist rebukes from within his own faith, our own faith. But here's where we really get serious because of our research. Here's where the seed really takes root.
We use resources like Ancestry and Find a Grave. And in Find a Grave, we discovered that Lillian, Jeffrey, and Marguerite were all buried in the same grave right here in Nashua, New Hampshire, at the Edgewood Cemetery. So I set off and I went. The Find a Grave website gives you a map of where the grave is. And I can read a map, and I followed the map, and I went there, and there was nothing. And I looked around, and I couldn't find anything nearby. And I saw that the office door was open, the cemetery office door. And so I walked over there, and there was somebody there, and I asked him, and he went and dug in the files, and he came out with a hand drawing showing where this gravesite was. And I looked at the drawing, I said, well, I was there. I can't find anything. And he walked me over to the place, and he said, it's right here. And there was nothing there. There was no stone. And that was just just, I mean, talk about canceling people. It was just devastating. And when I brought that information back to the team and to Allison, it was obvious that we now knew what we had to do, and we had some goals to set.
So you found this unmarked grave. You found out that Jeffrey has 2 living daughters, and I remember kind of two reactions that came up from you all. One being, we want to put a grave marker here. The other being, we want to apologize for this. We want to, when we reach out to these relatives, Jeffrey's relatives, his daughters, we don't just want to ask them if we can put a grave there. We want to let them know that we're really sorry for what happened to their father, and how not just our congregation but our whole faith treated him. I remember a lot of work went into it.
Because it was so clear from the many years of service by the Campbell family that the faith meant a lot to them. And then, of course, there's Jeffrey's famous words from the letter to Dottie where he says, "I would still undertake the call if I had my life to relive." It was clear that this family had absolutely no ambiguity about where they wanted to be. It was just a question of them being treated horribly by the people around them because of their race.
We decided we had to have a service in which we presented all this information, and we also put together a display of many of these documents, highlighting some of the key issues that were brought up, and also highlighting some of the things that Jeffrey and Marguerite did within the church. And we wanted to present all of this to our own community as a starting point, and also the whole issue of the gravesite. We put together the service, and I think people were blown away. It was just a very intense experience.
It felt to me that putting a grave marker on their grave would begin the beginning of atonement. It felt like a very necessary atonement.
Our research project now had a goal. Our random little seed had definitely taken root. This family we'd found, who our denomination and our society had treated so poorly, they had grabbed hold of the soil of our imaginations, because we could still, in a way, help them, or at least find a little justice on their behalf. To her credit, Reverend Allison helped us to face this unpleasant history head on. She didn't try to brush off its seriousness, and she wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. So we did contact both of Jeffrey Campbell's daughters, and we did get letters back from both, giving us their blessing and their appreciation of our apology. But it was clear there was a lot of sadness there as well. In fact, one of them told us that they remembered Jeffrey's sister Marguerite, their Aunt Rita, and remembered her as being, quote, the saddest person I ever knew. And so now we needed to grow our seed bigger for all to see. We needed to fertilize it, to foster it, and spread the word. So we started work on creating a gravestone and planning a service of remembrance and inviting people to hear this sobering story.
In order to pay for the gravestone and other things, we started a Faithify campaign, which raised a fairly significant amount of money. There was some remainder which we then donated to BLUE, the Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism, and we've attempted to maintain that some donation like that in succeeding years.
We called it a service of remembrance and reconciliation, and that was in September 2018. And we started with a big service here at the church. You want to share more about that?
We invited the mayor of the city and all the aldermen. We invited folks from the NAACP of Nashua. We invited, who else? People from the UUA. And yeah, UU, people from UU congregations from around the northern district. Yeah.
And in the service, we told the Campbell story again, and we also had some speakers.
From the UUA came Carrie McDonald, and they read an absolutely radical, humility-based apology to the Campbell daughters. And I personally, at the time, I don't know how the daughters felt, but I thought, wow, that's what needs to be done. That's what we need to do. It was very moving.
Good afternoon. I'm Carrie McDonald. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Unitarian Universalist Association, the headquarters and central organization of the 1,000+ UU congregations and communities across this country. We're located in Boston. I want to offer, on behalf of the UUA, a humble apology to Jeffrey, Marguerite, Lillian, Francis, their family. Their daughter Jocelyn is here today. I apologize. I apologize for the slanderous words that we printed in our publications. I apologize for the ways in which we did not help these reverends find a pulpit and for not honoring their ministry properly. But I also need to say thank you. Thank you for believing in us, for believing in this faith, for casting your lot with us, because I know it cost you dearly. I can only imagine what would have been illuminated had the brilliant light of these ancestors been permitted to shine to its fullest. May we choose a different path as a congregation and a community and a wider faith that allows us to live up to the aspiration that you had for us. Thank you.
After the service in the church, we all headed over to the cemetery there and did a graveside remembrance service. Was there anything that struck folks from that experience? I found it really beautiful when we, at the end, everyone had been given a flower who came, and we invited folks to place their flower on the grave as a sign of our commitment to continuing to tell this story and to continuing to work for a world where what happened to the Campbells doesn't happen again, where we don't have folks experiencing that kind of racism or any kind of racism, either in our faith or in the larger world. And it was beautiful to watch people place their flowers on the grave, and I was struck by the reverence with which people did that. That there really was a sense that, but they took a moment to, I hope, internalize that commitment. And we covered that grave. It was fully covered with flowers and with our commitment to the future.
And because we had extra money from Faithify, we put a plaque with the Campbell family name on it.
This room that we are in now was going to be renamed the Campbell Chapel in honor of the Campbell family.
And the reason that's all up there is, hopefully, when visitors come to this part of the church, or when kids are in this part of the church, because this is also the faith formation wing of the church, and they see that, they will ask the question, who are the Campbells? And why are they important? And we can tell them.
So our researcher gardeners had really nurtured one little seed into a serious and significant bloom. What comes next in the ongoing circle of life? Yeah, harvesting. And in this case, harvesting for the purpose of getting more seeds and spreading these additional seeds around the community, even if the flowers are prickly or problematic. We wanted the Campbell story to be heard more widely and its lessons to be learned more widely. Our team packaged up the informative and moving service that we'd presented to our own congregation, and we took it on the road. We're giving a voice to the Campbell family, to anyone who's willing to listen.
We then started taking the service to just other UU churches in New Hampshire, as well as Vermont and Massachusetts.
Yes, we took the service to seven other congregations, and all of those congregations were moved and surprised by the story. I say not infrequently that most UUs remember James Reed, but we don't remember Jeffrey Campbell. We were abolitionists. We were, we were fighting for the right side in a lot of ways, and we were also not letting Jeffrey Campbell have a pulpit. But the service was well received was very hopeful to me. That nobody came up and said, "What do you mean?" Like no one fought us about the truth of our story, which I think in other situations there might be some gaslighting, like that didn't really happen, but it did, and so we had a good experience there.
Also, we've taken that now to the local chapter of the NAACP, got some very good feedback and some perhaps other opportunities to take the Campbell story to other parts of New Hampshire. So.
The story also helped us build some connections in New Hampshire, I think, because we connected with the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire, which is an organization that is committed to telling these stories of Black New Hampshire folks from our history. Sharing the story helped us connect to them, and they actually came to our service and spoke there, and we've stayed connected with them and active in their programming ever since, which I think has been a really valuable connection for us.
Well, there was one other thing that there was an article about this whole story in the UU World, and that was very gratifying and important that it get out there.
Mm-hmm. And there was also a piece in New Hampshire Public Radio as well.
Yeah.
If we gardeners are lucky, we may find that our thriving flowers are perennials, the kind that need to be cared for every year and that then give us their blessings again and again. This is our hope for this story and for our congregation. And so our Reverend Allison invented our yearly Campbell Day of Action, where we not only retell the story uncovered by our research, but also we all take some real action. That action can be political or physical or whatever is appropriate for the current season and the current climate.
So we also as a congregation have continued to talk about the Campbells. And we didn't want it to be just talk, right? I think from the beginning it has felt really important to us that sharing this story is not the end of what we do, but that it is a reminder of our commitment to work for a world where white supremacy isn't a part of who we are as Unitarian Universalists. Even bigger than that, isn't a part of who we are as people in the world. So this past year we had our first annual Campbell Day of Action.
Well, there were actually 2 or 3 different activities. One was sort of short workshop discussions between various of our racial and social justice teams with the congregation, how other people might be involved in some of these things.
One of the workshops was presented by one of the members of our congregation who is a state representative, and she talked about how that governing body works and how we can get our voices heard.
Another part of the Campbell Day of Action included activities for children. So I remember on that day being with my 2 kids, designing some protest signs.
And, to put the flowers on the grave and the wreath and so forth. And Gloria Timmons, the membership VP of the local NACP chapter, laid a bouquet of flowers. So it was really a very moving service again. again, sort of recognizing or reinforcing the idea that these three people really who had sort of been disappeared by not just society, but our ancestors, our religious ancestors, had just been disappeared. And it felt very good to try to make that right as much as we possibly could.
So that's the journey that our research has taken us on. And creating this workshop for you has given us the chance to step back and think about the powerful ways in which this work affected each of us. We reflected about what it's like for us as gardeners. What's it like to encourage so many majestic flowers to grow all around the community and all across the seasons?
It was really hard for me. I was very disappointed. This wasn't 150 years ago. This was, 40 years ago. And I pulled away and I said, this isn't the faith that they say it is, and it really put me into a place of discernment and lots of reading and lots of studying and trying to decide if this is the right place for me. And I have come to the conclusion that it is, that there probably is no church that has done too much better than us. And this work is very important, and this is a way to do the work, so I am now committed to do it through the UU lens.
In several places in his writings and letters, he talks about the disparity, the contradiction between what the church preaches and what it does. That is something that we struggle with today. It was very overt and very blatant in his life experience, but it isn't over. So
going back to Jeffrey Campbell's own writings, I think for me just those words from the letter to Dottie, where he said that he would still undertake the call, he had his life to relive, that really stuck with me in a powerful way, because it just said so clearly how much he valued the Unitarian Universalist faith, and it made me have to reflect on if he could find this much value in it despite being constantly rejected or pushed away. This faith really is something special and something to be held on to.
I think I've always been more of a loner and not a really activist kind of person. But becoming involved in this project, I've never felt like there was a really big thing that I can do. But this was kind of a small thing in a way, just, a small group of us who did the initial research. I'm actually very proud of what we have accomplished and what I've accomplished. I think I've grown through this process. I certainly believe that my friends here have grown through this process. And the hope is, of course, that our church and the community has also grown through this process, this discovery that this family was treated so badly, to me is just a stunning, it is a fact of history. So, let's do more history.
Let's do better.
Yeah. And I think, to your point, Harry, I do think it has changed our congregation as well, this work. So we are in what we sometimes categorize as a white denomination in a white state. And yet, this story tells us that's not true, right? And not only is it not true right now, which we know by looking at our congregation, but also it has never been true. And I think that has really opened people's eyes in our congregation, and made us think about ourselves and our spiritual ancestors differently. And I think it's also opened the door to other research and other ways of delving into our past. One of the outgrowths of this was a group looking into the land that our congregation is on, and also where our wealth came from. That has been powerful work of rethinking about where we are in the north, of northern part of the United States, but we were not untouched by slavery. Most of the wealth of our congregation comes from the cotton mills here in the early 1800s. And it was slaves who were picking that cotton. So our wealth comes directly from that. So I think it's opened up doors for our congregation and for ways of rethinking about our history and who we have been.
Maybe some of our listeners today are intrigued by our congregation's research and its repentance and its actions. Maybe you're wondering about your own church, your own archives, and your own spiritual ancestors. What advice would our panelists offer to you or to anyone considering this research? For anyone who's going to try gardening in your own garden?
Just go looking, you know. I mean, there's a lot of literature out there, like Marson Reed's material. I mean, this church wasn't the only church he wrote about. Also, you know, think of your church in its historical context, and that might inspire some avenues of investigation. I mean, Allison mentioned the connection between this Northeastern church and slavery. I think that is probably true for many other UU churches.
Yeah, I would say just prepare for a lot of complexity, prepare for not finding all the answers to the questions that you want, but also I think it's good to have discrete projects to be working on with this kind of material. So have something like the sermon that we did, or have something like the display that we made. So even if you don't have answers to all of your questions, you have something to share with the larger congregation.
And I would say, as you jump in and get excited about the research and learn things, expect pushback from folks who don't want to accept the truth. Who, there may be people who feel personally that you're personally attacking them. There might be folks who say, oh, you know, it was a different time. There'll be a lot of justifications about what happened, and don't give up.
Is there anything you'd add, Harry?
Be skeptical of what you've been told.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think these stories are in every congregation's past.
To imagine
We're
that,
in America.
right, to imagine that somehow the United States exists and the things that exist in the United States are here, but we somehow are magically, you know, removed from them, that's a mistake.
Yeah.
We are not magically removed. We are absolutely in the thick of it, like everyone is. The other thing to consider, you were saying we're a white state in a white congregation in a white religion. So we shouldn't focus on these racial justice issues. It's important to remember when you're doing this research that you too have a race. White is a race too. And so people say, well, I don't have to worry about that because all those others are over there. No, we're all in this together, I think. And the good news is that because we are a piece of that, we can change it. We can change our relationship to the past by looking at it carefully and saying, wow, this was the past, let's change it. So I think that's why you should study history, you know, so you could see your place there.
Yeah, so part of what makes the study of history special is that by sorting through all of these documents, you get to decide who you are going to pay attention to at that moment. And there are lots of traces, faint or otherwise, of people who in their day, their voice might not have been very loud, their voice might not have been heard very often, but you as a historian at that moment, when you are reading in the archive, you can decide to listen to their voice, and you can then share their words with the people that you are sharing your history with. And that's important because there are lots of people out there who don't want you practicing history like this. They want you to just get your history from statues that they themselves build. So refuse to settle for that.
Yeah, I think sometimes people don't think of history as activism. But I think the fact that there is so much effort going into trying to stop us from teaching history, and so the fact that people are working so hard to try to silence these stories tells you something about their power and about the power of telling everyone's stories from all parts of history, and that to me is proof that history is social justice too. The study of history is an act of justice.
Thank you to our viewers and listeners for coming on this research journey with us. Thanks for bearing witness as our unexpected seed turned into a prickly but positive flower that we're now trying to spread throughout the community in Nashua, New Hampshire, and beyond. We do understand that telling our story today cannot change the way we treated the Reverend Jeffrey W. Campbell and Lillian and Marguerite Campbell. Our new gravestone will not excuse the past racism of our faith denomination, and our new video presentations will not exactly correct the record. However, our work will help to center a small piece of Black history about some smart, kind people who had inherent worth and dignity, people who until now had been kept out of the history books. I'll give the last words to our very own Reverend Allison Palm, who is our chief gardener and our fearless leader.
We've talked some about the fact that Jeffrey Campbell never got to preach here in Nashua in his home pulpit. And I know he felt disappointment in that. And I think we feel a lot of disappointment as well that that's not something that this congregation ever got to experience. They never got to experience him preaching here. But now, even though he's not around anymore, we do speak his words from our pulpit at least once a year. So even though he's not alive, even though he never got the chance while he was alive, it feels like now he gets to preach here at least a little bit every year.